All right, so today we're going deep on this pretty wild situation
Yeah.
surrounding a spiritual leader named Chris Butler,
Yeah?
also known as Siddhaswarup, and his organization.
The material's fascinating. It's articles and analyses written by former followers
Right,
of Butler's organization,
exactly.
which has a few names. Iwoki, Mr. Czaitanii, Siv Czaitania Mission.
Yeah.
Some people know it as mantra.pl.
Yeah, and so our mission here is to kind of help you understand the controversy surrounding this guy
Okay.
and the organization specifically from the perspective of these former members.
And what I find so interesting about it is that it's not just about this one man or this one group.
Right.
This is, it raises some bigger questions.
Yes.
About authority, belief,
Yeah.
and how we even determine what's true,
Mm.
which is something I think we all gravel with in different areas of our lives.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's unpack this then. So who is this guy, Chris Butler? And what's the deal with this organization?
So Butler leads this organization that claims to be grounded in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Okay, and for those who might not be familiar, could you give us a little background on Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Sure, it's a branch of Hinduism that originated in Bengal, India.
Okay,
It emphasizes devotion to Krishna.
gotcha.
It's a really rich tradition, focus on bhakti, which is like the path of devotion and love for the divine.
Okay, got it. So how does Butler and his organization fit into all of this?
Well, that's where it gets a little messy.
Okay.
The former members who wrote these pieces that we're looking at, they actually describe the organization as a cult,
Wow.
and Butler as a charlatan.
Okay.
They allege a lot of secrecy around Butler's life, an insistence on absolute obedience from the followers, and even accusations of financial exploitation.
That's heavy stuff. It
Yeah.
sounds like a pretty stark contrast to the principles of Gaudiya Vaishnavism that you just described.
Exactly. Gaudiya Vaishnavism is really all about humility and selfless service.
Right.
Yet these former members are saying that Butler himself lives a super lavish lifestyle, far removed from the experiences of his followers, and profits off their labor.
Yeah.
So there's this distinct tension
Yeah.
between what the tradition teaches and how Butler is accused of behaving.
You know, one detail that really stuck out to me from the material was the claim that Butler actually broke his vows of celibacy and got married,
Right.
which seems like a significant departure
Yeah.
from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava principles where celibacy is expected of spiritual leaders.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how followers reconcile that apparent contradiction.
Right.
Was it explained away, ignored, or did it cause like a genuine crisis of faith for some people?
Yeah.
I think this speaks to the power of belief and the complexities of what we call cognitive dissonance. When people hold conflicting beliefs,
Yeah.
they will often go to great lengths to rationalize or downplay those inconsistencies.
Yeah, it's like our minds are trying to protect us from the discomfort of facing those contradictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this situation seems to be full of those.
Yeah.
For instance, while promoting humility and surrender, Butler allegedly demanded this absolute obedience.
Yeah.
And actually, he saw himself as being able to judge the sins of others.
Oh, wow.
He said he could see through their attempts to appear, quote unquote, clean in his eyes.
That's intense.
It is. It makes you wonder about what kind of psychological dynamics are at play.
Yeah. So how did Butler manage to maintain this level of control over his followers?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, former members describe his teachings as being really heavily focused on fear
Okay.
and the potential for rejection by Krishna.
Okay.
They claim he would constantly remind people of their supposed sinfulness and unworthiness,
Yeah.
instilling this deep-seated fear of not being loved by Krishna.
It sounds like he was twisting the concept of bhakti, which is
Yeah.
supposed to be about love and devotion, into something much darker
Exactly.
and more manipulative.
That's exactly what the sources are suggesting.
Yeah.
They actually quote Butler from a message to his followers,
Oh, wow.
where he says, and I quote, "We're afraid that Krishna will not love us, that he will not love me if he knew how sinful I am, how dirty I am, how lost I am."
Wow.
This is a powerful statement that tapped into that primal fear of rejection.
Yeah. Big time. And this wasn't just a casual observation, right? What was the impact of these fear-based teachings on his followers?
Well, the sources claim these teachings were used to ensure unquestioning obedience, willingness to work for free, and a steady flow of financial contributions to Butler and the organization. The fear, they say, was a tool to manipulate followers into serving his interests.
That's really disturbing. But sadly, it does sound like a pretty classic cult tactic, creating
Yeah.
dependence on the leader by playing on those fears and insecurities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what's even more disturbing is that this alleged control extended way beyond the spiritual teachings.
Oh, wow.
The sources detail what they call the confidential, unwritten, perverted, and mafia rules. Yeah, that govern the organization.
Whoa, okay, what kind of rules are we talking about here?
Well, imagine this. Former members say they were strictly forbidden from associating with anyone who had left the group,
Wow,
even close friends and family.
that's intense.
They were also banned from interacting with any other Gaudiya Vaishnava communities.
That seems incredibly restrictive. It goes against this whole idea of Sangha, which is
Yeah.
the community aspect that's so important in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Exactly. It's a form of isolation designed to keep followers dependent on Butler's organization for information and validation.
Yeah.
And they were cut off from alternative perspectives, making it way harder to question what they were being told.
Wow, but it didn't stop there, did it? What other kinds of rules are we talking about?
So one of the most striking examples was this alleged requirement to actually get written permission from Butler himself.
What?
Yeah, before starting any kind of business,
Seriously?
you had to submit a detailed proposal
What?
outlining your entire business plan for his personal approval.
That's wild. I can't even imagine having to get approval from my spiritual leader
Right.
to start a business. It really blurs the lines
Yeah.
between spiritual guidance and just controlling people's lives.
It does. And it really makes you wonder about his motives. Right?
Yeah.
Was this really about protecting his followers' financial well-being?
Yeah.
Or was it about ensuring no one was competing with his own business interests?
It's a great point. And it speaks to a broader pattern of this alleged financial exploitation that the sources are describing.
Right.
They claim there was this constant pressure to donate money,
Mm-hmm.
to contribute to Butler's personal wealth, and even work for free or for very low wages.
It paints a picture of an organization that's prioritizing its own financial gain over the well-being of its followers.
Right.
And it's a classic red flag when it comes to identifying potentially harmful groups.
Yeah, so we're seeing signs of isolation, financial pressure, and these really strange rules. It's starting to sound a lot like what we associate with that term cult.
Yeah, and in fact, the sources use that term
Okay.
to describe Butler's organization.
Okay.
They list several common characteristics of cults that they say are present here.
Okay.
Authoritarian leadership, isolation from the outside world, exploitation of members,
Yeah.
and the use of fear and guilt as control tactics.
It's like a perfect storm of manipulation designed to keep followers trapped and subservient.
And the sources argue that this control was maintained not only through these rules and teachings, but also through a system of intimidation.
Oh, wow.
They describe a specific role within the organization called the mobber.
Mobber. That doesn't sound good.
No, it
What does it
doesn't.
mean?
So imagine someone designated to actually target and harass anyone who dared to question Butler's authority or deviate from the group's norms.
Wow.
They allegedly use a variety of psychological tactics to isolate and silence dissenters, essentially bullying them into conformity.
So you couldn't speak up, you couldn't leave, and you were constantly being reminded of your supposed unworthiness. It sounds incredibly suffocating and psychologically damaging.
And that is what these former members allege.
Wow.
They describe a climate of fear where anyone who stepped out of line was met with swift and brutal consequences.
This is like a chilling reminder that even within spiritual communities, which are supposed to be these places of love and support, there's always a potential for that abuse of power.
Absolutely. And while it's important to remember that we're only hearing one side of the story,
Right.
these accounts raise serious concerns that deserve to be examined further.
Yeah. This all paints a very dark picture of Butler's organization. But before we go any further, I think it's important to just step back
Yeah?
and offer a more balanced perspective on Gaudiya Vaishnavism itself.
Right.
After all, there are many legitimate Gaudiya Vaishnava communities all over the world
Absolutely.
that are nothing like what we're talking about here.
Right? Authentic Gaudiya Vaishnavism emphasizes love, compassion, and a genuine guru-disciple relationship based on respect and free will. It's not about fear, control, or exploitation.
So how did this organization manage to twist those principles so drastically?
That's a complex question, and one that we'll be exploring further as we go along.
Yeah.
But I think a key point to remember is that in genuine Gaudiya Vaishnavism, a true guru guides and inspires,
Right.
but never coerces or manipulates.
So it's about finding a teacher who supports your spiritual journey,
Yeah,
but respects your autonomy and your right to make your own choices.
exactly. and that includes the choice to leave. A healthy spiritual community won't try to hold people captive or make them feel guilty for wanting to move on.
It sounds like what we're seeing here is a group that's hijacked the language and imagery of Gaudiya Vaishnavism to create a system of control that serves the leader's interest,
Right.
not the spiritual well-being of the followers.
That's a pretty accurate assessment.
Wow.
And it's a reminder that we need to be discerning consumers of information, especially when it comes to matters of faith and spirituality.
Well said. Now, we've gotten a pretty clear picture of the negative side of things.
Right.
But before we move on, I think it's crucial to take a deeper look at authentic Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about the positive aspects of this tradition. What are some of the core principles that draw people to it?
Well, at its core, it's a path of love and devotion.
Okay.
It's about cultivating a deep and personal relationship with Krishna, who's seen as this supreme source of love and bliss.
Okay.
So, followers engage in practices like chanting, meditation, and studying sacred texts to deepen their connection with Krishna.
That sounds really beautiful. It's so different from the fear-based approach that these former members describe.
It is. And it's important to remember that there are many legitimate Gaudiya Vaishnava communities around the world that are dedicated to spreading Krishna's love and teachings in a positive and ethical way. They emphasize free will, respect for others, and selfless service.
Okay.
They're a testament to the transformative power of bhakti, the path of devotion, when it's practiced with sincerity and integrity.
That's reassuring to hear. So even though we're exploring this dark side of this tradition, it's important to acknowledge that there's also a lot of light.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to emphasize that what we're doing here is not about condemning religion or spirituality at all.
Right.
It's about being aware of the potential for abuse that can exist within any system of belief and empowering ourselves to make informed choices about who and what we follow.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, one of the things that really struck me from these sources is the level of detail they provide about the inner workings of this organization.
Right.
They even share specific examples of those confidential, unwritten, perverted, and mafia rules that we touched on earlier.
That's a great observation. And it speaks to the power of firsthand accounts in helping us understand situations like this. These former members are providing a valuable service by sharing their experiences and exposing these tactics that were allegedly used to control and manipulate them.
And I think it's not just about exposing the truth, it's also about helping other people recognize the warning signs and avoid falling into similar traps.
Exactly. By shedding light on these tactics, they are empowering other people to be more critical and discerning when evaluating a group or a leader.
100%. They're hoping to break the cycle of abuse and create a safer and more informed spiritual landscape.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics about these unwritten rules. What are some of the most disturbing examples you came across?
One of the most striking examples is the alleged prohibition against associating with ex-members.
Yeah.
So former members say they were strictly forbidden from having any contact with anyone who had left the group, even if they were close friends or family.
It's like they were trying to erase those people from existence.
It is a classic cult tactic.
Yeah.
It serves a specific purpose. By cutting off contact with ex-members, the group controls the narrative and prevents their followers from hearing different perspectives.
So they're living in an echo chamber where the only voices they hear are those that reinforce the leader's authority and the group's ideology.
Right.
Wow.
And this isolation makes it so much easier to manipulate and control people. If you're constantly being told that the outside world is dangerous and that only the group has the truth, you're much less likely to question or challenge what you're being told.
Right. And these sources suggest that this isolation extended beyond just personal relationships.
Yes.
They claim that followers were also discouraged from interacting with other Gaudiya Vaishnava communities.
That's right.
Which is disturbing because it goes against one of the core principles of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is Sangha, or that spiritual community.
It's true.
So it's not just about isolating individuals, it's about isolating the entire group from any outside influence or alternative perspective.
Exactly. It creates a really insular and controlled environment where it's way easier to enforce conformity and obedience.
Right.
And it makes it harder for people to leave.
Yeah.
Because they've been led to believe that they have nowhere else to go.
It's like they're trapped in this spiritual prison.
That is a powerful analogy. And the sources suggest that this sense of entrapment was further reinforced by a number of other unwritten rules that governed every aspect of a follower's life.
Okay, I'm ready for some more examples. What else did they share?
Well, one of the most bizarre rules former members describe is this alleged requirement to get written permission from Butler before starting a business.
Still can't get over that.
It's wild.
Yeah.
They had to submit a detailed proposal outlining their business plan, and Butler would personally review and approve or deny it.
So wild. It sounds more like a dictatorship than a spiritual community.
It is a clear example of how these rules extended beyond just spiritual matters and went into the realm of economic control.
And it makes you wonder, what was Butler's motivation? Was he genuinely concerned about his followers' financial well-being, or was he simply trying to maintain control and ensure that no one was competing with his own business ventures?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that the sources don't explicitly answer, but the fact that they highlight this rule so prominently suggests that they believe it was motivated by something more sinister
Yeah.
than just a paternalistic concern for his followers' financial well-being.
Right. It raises some red flags, and it
Yeah.
speaks to the broader issue of financial exploitation,
Exactly.
which is a common theme in these cult dynamics.
Right. Cults often use a variety of tactics to extract money from followers,
Right.
whether it's required donations, mandatory tithing, or pressure to work for free or for very low wages.
And these sources suggest that Butler's organization was no exception.
Right.
They describe this culture of financial pressure, with followers constantly being reminded of their duty to support the group and to contribute to Butler's personal wealth.
Right. And this financial pressure often created a sense of obligation and indebtedness, which made it even harder for people to leave.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
You're trapped financially.
Yeah.
You're isolated socially.
Yeah.
And you're constantly being bombarded with these messages that reinforce your dependence on the leader and the group.
And the sources suggest that Butler's organization used a number of other unwritten rules to tighten their grip even further.
Okay, give me another example.
Okay. Another rule that former members describe is the strict prohibition against speaking negatively about Butler or the organization.
Seriously?
They claim that even expressing doubts or concerns could lead to punishment or ostracism.
That's so controlling. It's like they were trying to stifle any critical thinking or dissent.
Exactly. And it created this culture of fear and self-censorship. People were afraid to speak their minds or to share their true feelings for fear of repercussions.
It's like they were living in a totalitarian state.
It is. It highlights how these unwritten rules permeated every aspect of a follower's life.
Yeah, it's interesting that these rules weren't explicitly written down or codified.
Right.
They were just sort of understood and enforced through a combination of social pressure and fear.
That's common in cults.
Yeah.
By keeping the rules unspoken,
Right.
it makes them harder to challenge or refute.
Yeah.
It also gives the leader more flexibility to interpret and enforce them as they see fit.
So it's a constantly shifting landscape where the rules can change at any moment,
Exactly.
depending on the leader's whims.
And that creates this sense of uncertainty and anxiety, which further reinforces their dependence on the leader for guidance.
It's very insidious.
It is. And the sources suggest that this control was maintained through manipulation, intimidation, and outright abuse.
Wow, this is getting really heavy.
It is.
All right.
And it's important to remember that these are just allegations from former members. We don't have Butler's side of the story.
Right, but even if only a fraction of these allegations are true,
Right.
it paints a really disturbing picture of what was going on inside this organization.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that spiritual abuse is a very real phenomenon.
Yes.
And it can have devastating consequences for those who are caught up in it.
I think we've covered a lot of ground so far in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've explored the allegations against Butler and his organization, examined the tactics that were allegedly used to control and manipulate followers, and we've talked about the importance of critical thinking and discernment when it comes to spiritual matters.
Right. And we've touched on the positive aspects of Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Right.
highlighting that there are many legitimate and ethical communities within this tradition.
Right. So before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I'd like to pose a final question,
Okay.
a provocative one for you to ponder.
I'm ready.
Is it possible that someone can genuinely believe they're acting in the best interests of others while simultaneously exploiting them?
Whoa! That's a profound question.
Yeah.
It really gets to the heart of the complexities we're dealing with here. It's absolutely possible for someone to hold what they believe are positive intentions.
Yeah.
Even genuinely believe they're helping others while their actions are causing harm.
So even with good intentions,
Yeah,
things can go wrong.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Self-deception is a powerful force.
Yeah.
A leader might truly believe their authority is necessary, their guidance is vital,
Yeah.
and any questioning is a threat, maybe even a spiritual attack. This can lead them to justify controlling behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
all while thinking they're doing what's best for their followers.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
So how do we reconcile that? If even good intentions can be twisted, how can anyone ever trust a spiritual leader or group?
That's a key point.
Yeah.
That's where discernment becomes so important.
Okay.
And discernment isn't about abandoning faith or spirituality.
Yeah.
It's about developing this healthy skepticism,
Yeah.
looking beyond just charisma or claims of authority,
Right.
and really examining the fruits of their teachings and actions.
Yeah.
What impact are they actually having on people's lives?
So what are some of those fruits we should be looking for? How can we tell the difference between a healthy spiritual community and one that might be harmful?
Well, one key difference is transparency.
Okay.
A genuine spiritual community should be open and honest
Yeah.
about its teachings, its practices, and especially its finances.
Mhm.
There shouldn't be any secrets or hidden agendas.
That makes a lot of sense. Secrecy breeds mistrust,
Yeah.
and it's often a sign that something's not quite right. What else should we pay attention to?
Another crucial factor is respect for individual autonomy.
Okay.
A healthy spiritual community should encourage personal growth and critical thinking. They won't pressure members to conform or punish those who question or disagree.
So it's about finding that balance between guidance and freedom. It's about having a teacher or mentor who supports your spiritual journey, but respects your right to make your own choices.
Exactly. And that includes the choice to leave.
Mm-hmm.
A genuine spiritual community won't try to hold people captive
Right.
or make them feel guilty for wanting to move on.
You know, that makes me think about those confidential, unwritten, perverted, and mafia rules
Right.
we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Those are huge red flags.
Totally.
No legitimate spiritual group should ever forbid its members
Right.
from associating with ex-members
Yeah.
or exploring other spiritual paths.
I completely agree.
Oh.
Those kinds of rules are designed
Yeah.
to isolate and control,
Yeah.
not to liberate and empower.
So it's like they're trying to cut you off from any support system outside of the group,
Right.
making you completely dependent on them.
That's right. It creates an environment where it's much harder to think critically or to seek help if you need it.
So if we're looking for a spiritual path or community, how can we know who to trust? It feels like there are so many potential pitfalls out there.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming,
Yeah.
especially with so many options these days.
Right.
But I think it boils down to a few key principles.
Okay. I'm all ears. What are your top tips?
Okay. First and foremost,
Ugh.
trust your gut.
Okay.
If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore those red flags
Mhm.
or try to rationalize them away.
It's like our intuition is trying to tell us something,
Yeah,
and we need to listen.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Along with trusting your gut, do your research. Don't just rely on the group's self-promotion.
Right.
Talk to current and former members. Look for independent sources of information and get a sense of the group's reputation.
Yeah. Don't just take their word for it.
Yeah.
See what other people are saying,
Right.
both good and bad.
Exactly. And remember, no one has a monopoly on the truth.
Right.
Be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers or who tries to discourage you from questioning or exploring.
That's a really good point. It's like they're trying to shut down your critical thinking,
Exactly.
which is never a good sign.
Never. A healthy spiritual community should encourage you to ask questions, to challenge assumptions,
Right.
and to form your own understanding.
Right. And it's okay to change your mind, right? To realize that a path that once resonated with you no longer does.
Of course, finding a spiritual path is a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, growing, and evolving.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things that really struck you from these sources was this specific example they shared about Srila Prabhupada,
Yes.
the founder of Etiquette.
You know, Etiquette is another prominent Gaudiya Vaishnava organization,
Okay.
probably best known for the Hare Krishna chanting.
Right. Right. I've heard of them.
Yeah.
What was it about Prabhupada that stood out to you?
The source recounts this anecdote about Prabhupada being asked why he was reading his own books.
Okay.
And his response was so interesting.
Yeah.
He's like, they were dedicated to me.
Oh, wow.
He essentially disavowed ownership of his own writings,
Okay.
emphasizing that they belong to the tradition, to Krishna.
Wow, that's powerful. It highlights the selfless approach to spiritual knowledge that's at the heart of authentic Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Totally.
It's not about personal gain or control.
No.
It's about sharing those teachings
Yeah.
and helping others connect with Krishna.
It really serves as a stark contrast to the allegations surrounding Butler and his organization.
Right.
It's a reminder that true spiritual leadership is about service, not self-aggrandizement.
So if we're looking for signs of a genuine guru, a true spiritual guide,
Yeah,
what should we be looking for?
it's a great question.
What are the red flags?
The sources really highlight the importance of paying attention to how a leader treats their followers.
Okay.
Do they encourage critical thinking and questioning?
Yeah.
Or do they demand blind obedience?
Right.
Do they live a life of simplicity and service? Or are they surrounded by luxury and privilege at the expense of their followers?
Yeah.
Do they respect the boundaries of their disciples? Or do they engage in manipulation and control?
Those are all really important questions. It's like we need to look beyond the surface, beyond the charisma or the spiritual teachings,
Right.
and really examine how they're living their lives and how they're treating the people around them.
Absolutely. It's about looking at the whole picture, not just the parts they want you to see.
And I think it's also crucial to look at the overall atmosphere within the group.
Yes.
Is it supportive and loving,
Right.
or is it characterized by fear, guilt, and pressure to conform?
You're right. A healthy spiritual community should foster a sense of belonging and connection.
Right.
But it should also encourage personal growth and individual expression. It should be a place where people feel safe to question,
Right.
to disagree,
Right.
and to explore their own path without fear of judgment or reprisal.
It sounds like Butler's organization was the complete opposite of that.
That's what these former members' accounts suggest.
Yeah.
They describe a climate of fear, isolation,
Yeah.
and intense pressure to conform. They talk about being cut off from their families and friends, discouraged from pursuing their own interests, and subjected to psychological manipulation and abuse.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact this must have had on their lives. And it makes you wonder how people get caught up in these kinds of situations in the first place.
Yeah.
What makes someone vulnerable to this kind of manipulation?
That's a question that psychologists and cult experts have been studying for decades,
Right.
and there's no easy answer.
Mm-hmm.
But some common factors include a lack of critical thinking skills, a need for belonging and acceptance,
Right.
and susceptibility to charismatic authority figures.
Mm-hmm.
People who are going through a tough time,
Yeah.
like a personal loss or a crisis of faith,
Right.
might also be more vulnerable to the allure of a group that promises certainty and unconditional love.
It's a reminder that we all have vulnerabilities and that anyone can be susceptible to manipulation under the right circumstances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to be aware of the tactics that cults use and to develop those critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
We need to be able to evaluate information objectively, question authority, and trust our own instincts.
Yeah.
If something feels wrong, it probably is.
You know, it's interesting that these sources describe Butler as a narcissist.
Ah.
Is that a common trait among cult leaders?
Narcissism definitely comes up a lot in these discussions. Narcissists tend to have this inflated sense of self-importance,
Yeah.
a lack of empathy for others, and a need for admiration and validation.
Mm-hmm.
They'll often exploit others to meet their own needs and have a really difficult time accepting criticism or admitting wrongdoing.
That definitely seems to fit with what we're hearing about Butler.
Right.
He allegedly demanded absolute obedience from his followers, lived this lavish lifestyle while they struggled financially, and refused to engage with any criticism of his teachings
Exactly.
or actions.
And the sources suggest that Butler's alleged narcissism actually played a key role in his ability to control and manipulate his followers.
Right.
By creating a system that revolved around his own needs and desires, he was able to maintain a position of power and authority.
Yeah. Expert speaker.
Yeah, it was a way to keep his position, even as his teachings and actions became increasingly controversial.
It's a disturbing example of how someone can just twist those spiritual principles
Yeah.
for their own personal gain.
Right.
And it highlights the importance of being discerning when it comes to choosing a spiritual path or following a leader.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that spiritual abuse is real
Yeah.
and that it can have devastating consequences.
Mm.
If you or someone you know is involved in a group that exhibits these kinds of cult-like characteristics,
Yeah,
it's so important to seek help and support. There are resources available
absolutely.
to help people understand and escape from these situations.
Now, even though we've been focusing on these allegations against Butler, I am curious
Yeah.
to hear more about the positive aspects of Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Okay.
What are some of the core principles that draw people to this tradition?
Well, at its heart, Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a path of love and devotion.
Okay.
It's about cultivating this deep personal relationship with Krishna, who is seen as this supreme source of love and bliss.
Okay.
So followers engage in a variety of different practices like chanting, meditation, studying sacred texts, all to deepen their connection with Krishna and to experience his love and grace in their lives.
It sounds beautiful and so different from the fear-based approach that these former members describe.
It is. And it's important to remember that there are many legitimate Gaudiya Vaishnava communities around the world that are dedicated to spreading Krishna's love and teachings in this positive and ethical way. These communities emphasize the importance of free will, respect for others, and selfless service.
Okay.
They're a testament to the transformative power of bhakti, that path of devotion, when it's practiced with sincerity and integrity.
That's reassuring to hear. So even though we're kind of exploring this dark side of the tradition, it's important to acknowledge that there's also a lot of light.
Totally. And I think it's also important to emphasize that this whole deep dive is not about condemning religion or spirituality in general.
Yeah.
It's about being aware of the potential for abuse that can exist within any system of belief.
Right.
And empowering ourselves to make informed choices about who and what we follow.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, religion and spirituality can be these powerful forces for good in the world.
Yeah.
But we also need to be aware of the potential for harm.
Of course.
And approach these things with a critical eye.
I completely agree.
So bring it back to those unwritten rules that we were discussing earlier.
Yes.
You mentioned that the sources provide some specific examples.
They did. And I think these examples are so valuable.
Yeah.
Because they give us this concrete understanding of how these rules were used to control and manipulate people.
Absolutely. It's one thing to talk about these abstract concepts like manipulation and control.
Right.
But it's another thing entirely to actually see how those things play out in real life.
Right. And these former members are giving us that window into what it was like to be inside this organization and subject to those rules.
So to bring it back to those rules, what were some of the most disturbing examples that you found?
Well, we already talked about the prohibition against associating with ex-members. But another really striking example is this rule against speaking negatively about Butler or the organization.
Oh, wow.
Former members claimed that even expressing doubts or concerns could lead to punishment or ostracism.
That's wild.
It is. It's like they were trying to create an environment where no one felt safe to speak their truth.
Right. And that kind of environment just breeds fear and self-censorship.
Absolutely.
People are afraid to speak their minds, to challenge what they're being told, or to even share their own struggles and doubts.
Right.
It creates this culture where everyone's just putting on a facade, pretending that everything is perfect.
Yeah. And that can be so damaging.
Yeah.
Because it prevents people from getting the support that they need.
Right.
And being able to process their experiences in a healthy way.
It isolates people even further.
Yeah.
Because they feel like they can't even be honest with anyone about what they're going through.
Exactly. It creates this atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust, where everyone is just walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might be perceived as disloyal or critical.
And all of this just serves to further strengthen the leader's control, right?
Oh.
Because if no one feels safe to speak up, then no one's going to challenge their authority.
It creates a system where dissent is effectively silenced.
Right.
And the leader's power just goes unchecked.
It's interesting that these sources use the term mafia rules to describe some of these unwritten rules.
Right.
What do you think they were trying to convey with that language?
I think it really speaks to the level of intimidation and fear that was present within this organization.
Okay.
They're drawing this parallel to the way that organized crime operates.
Right.
Where there's this code of silence, where anyone who breaks the rules faces serious consequences.
So it's not just about social pressure. It's about this real sense of danger and the threat of violence.
Right.
Even if it's psychological violence.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful form of control because it keeps people in line, not just because they want to belong,
right,
but because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't.
As we're talking about all of this, I can't help but think about the psychological impact this must have had on the people who were involved in this organization to be subjected to this level of control and manipulation. It must have been so traumatic.
Absolutely. It must have been.
Yeah.
And the sources describe the long-term consequences of this abuse.
Yeah.
They talk about struggling with anxiety, depression, PTSD, and even suicidal thoughts.
It's just a reminder that emotional abuse is real.
Yes.
And it's just as damaging as physical abuse.
And oftentimes it's much harder to recognize and escape from.
It's interesting that these sources specifically use the term psychological manipulation to describe what was happening.
Yeah.
What do you think they were trying to convey with that language?
I think they're highlighting the insidious nature of this type of abuse.
Mm.
It's not always overt or obvious.
Mm-hmm.
It's often subtle and gradual.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be difficult for people to even recognize that they're being manipulated, especially if it's coming from someone they trust and respect.
It's like they're slowly being brainwashed without even realizing it.
Exactly. And by the time they do realize what's happening, they may be so deeply entrenched in this group's ideology
Yeah.
and so dependent on the leader that it's incredibly difficult to break free.
So what are some of the signs that someone might be being psychologically manipulated?
Well, one common sign is this change in their personality or behavior.
Okay.
They might become more withdrawn, more secretive,
Right.
more defensive. They might start expressing beliefs that are totally out of character for them, or they might become increasingly critical of people outside of the group.
So it's like their whole worldview is starting to shift.
It is. And they might also become more isolated from their friends and family,
Right.
spending more and more time with the group and less time with people who aren't a part of it.
And this isolation just makes them even more vulnerable to that manipulation because they're losing that support system outside of the group.
Totally. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle.
Right.
The more isolated they become, the more dependent they are on the group for validation and support,
Yeah.
and the more susceptible they are to the leader's influence.
You know, as we're talking about this, I'm realizing these tactics aren't unique to cults.
No?
They're used in all sorts of contexts, from abusive relationships to political propaganda.
That's right. And that's what makes it so important to be aware of these dynamics and to understand how they work.
Yeah.
Because once you can see those patterns, you can start to protect yourself from them.
So what are some things that people can do to protect themselves from psychological manipulation?
One of the most important things is to develop those critical thinking skills.
Okay.
Learn to question what you're being told, to evaluate information objectively, and to think for yourself.
So don't just blindly accept what someone is telling you, even if they seem like an authority figure.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And another important thing is to maintain a strong support system outside of that group.
Okay.
Stay connected with your friends and your family, and don't let the group become your only source of validation and support.
So it's like having a reality check outside of that group's bubble.
Exactly. And if you do start to feel like you're being manipulated, don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Yeah.
There are therapists, counselors, support groups that can help you to understand what's happening and develop strategies for dealing with it.
Those are all really great tips.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that if you're ever feeling lost or confused,
Yeah.
or if you're questioning a group or a leader,
Right.
you are not alone.
You're not.
There are people who care and who want to help you find your way.
Absolutely.
One of the things that really struck me about these sources is their emphasis on the importance of self-awareness.
Yeah.
They talk about this need to understand our own vulnerabilities and to be honest with ourselves about why we might be drawn to a particular group or leader.
That's such a crucial point. Because often the things that make us vulnerable to manipulation are also the things that we're most ashamed of.
Yeah.
Or the things that we're trying to hide from ourselves.
So the more that we can understand and accept those parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
the less power they have over us.
Exactly. And that's where therapy and personal growth work can be so valuable. It helps us to confront those shadow parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And to integrate them into a more whole and authentic sense of self.
Right. And when we're more grounded in our own truth,
Yeah.
we're less likely to be swayed by someone else's version of reality.
Exactly. We become more discerning and more resilient to manipulation.
It's like all of this deep dive isn't just about one spiritual leader or one organization. It's about equipping ourselves with the tools to think critically and to make those informed choices.
Yes.
In all areas of our lives. So to our listener, we encourage you to take these conversations to heart
Please.
and start paying attention to these dynamics in your own life.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, where do I see these patterns playing out? Whom am I allowing to influence my thinking and my behavior? And am I making choices that are truly aligned with my own values and my own truth?
Those are powerful questions. And by asking them, we can start to reclaim our own power and create a world where manipulation and abuse just have no place.
Well said. Now, as we move towards the conclusion of this deep dive, I want to circle back to a question that we posed earlier.
Okay.
Is it possible for someone to genuinely believe they're acting in the best interests of others while simultaneously exploiting them?
That's the million-dollar question,
All right.
isn't it? I think it's one we really need to grapple with
Yeah.
if we want to understand the complexities of human behavior.
Okay, let's grapple then. Let's unpack that question. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the human psyche is incredibly complex.
Okay.
We're capable of holding completely contradictory beliefs and of justifying our actions in ways that might seem irrational to others.
So you're saying it's possible for someone to genuinely believe they're doing good, even if their actions are causing harm?
Yes. And I think there are a few different ways that this can happen.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear more about this. What are some of the ways that someone might convince themselves they're doing good, even if they're exploiting others?
One way is through what psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
This is the discomfort that we feel when we hold two or more conflicting beliefs, ideas, or values.
Okay.
And to reduce this discomfort, we often engage in all sorts of mental gymnastics
Yeah.
to try to reconcile those inconsistencies.
So it's like our minds are trying to protect us from the discomfort of facing our own contradictions.
Exactly. And in the context of a cult or an abusive relationship, this can manifest as a belief that the leader is always right,
Right.
even when their actions seem wrong or harmful.
So they're bending over backwards to justify that leader's behavior?
Yeah,
Even if it's at their own expense?
right. And they might even start to blame themselves for any problems or conflicts that arise rather than questioning the leader's authority.
So they're internalizing that abuse,
Yeah,
making it their own fault.
exactly. And it can be incredibly damaging because it erodes their sense of self-worth
Yeah.
and their ability to trust their own judgment.
It's like they're losing their sense of self in the process.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Another way that someone might genuinely believe they're acting in the best interests of others while exploiting them
Okay.
is through this belief in their own superiority.
So it's like they see themselves as being on a higher level,
Yeah,
and they believe that they have the right to control and manipulate others for their own good.
totally. They might believe that they have special knowledge or insight that other people don't have,
Right.
or that they're divinely appointed to lead and guide others.
And this belief in their own superiority just makes them blind to the harm that they're causing.
Totally. They might genuinely believe that they're acting out of love or compassion, but their actions are actually motivated by a need for power and control.
It's like this twisted form of altruism.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be seductive, both for the person who's wielding the power and for the people who are being manipulated.
Right.
Because it creates this illusion of safety and security.
Yeah.
It's like, if I just follow the leader, everything will be okay.
So it's like they're trading their own autonomy for a sense of certainty and belonging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be a tempting bargain,
Yeah.
especially if someone is feeling lost or vulnerable.
So how do we break free from these patterns? How do we learn to discern between genuine altruism and this manipulative control?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with developing our own self-awareness.
Okay.
You know, we need to understand our own vulnerabilities
Right.
and be honest with ourselves about why we might be drawn to a particular group or leader.
So the more we can understand and accept those parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
the less power they have over us.
Exactly. And that's where therapy and personal growth work can be so valuable.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us to confront those shadow parts of ourselves and integrate them into this more whole, authentic sense of self.
Right. And when we're more grounded in our own truth, we're less likely to be swayed by someone else's version of reality.
Clearly. We become more discerning and more resilient to manipulation.
As we're talking about this,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the broader implications here.
Right.
It's not just about cults. It's about the dynamics of power and control that play out
It is.
in all areas of life.
Right.
From politics to business to personal relationships.
Everywhere.
We're constantly bombarded with these messages that are designed to influence us.
That's right.
Our thinking and our behavior.
Yeah. And the more we can understand these dynamics, the more empowered we become to navigate them in a healthy and conscious way.
So this deep dive
Yeah.
isn't just about one spiritual leader or one organization. It's about equipping ourselves with the tools
Yes.
to think critically and make those informed choices in all areas of our lives.
I agree.
To our listener, we encourage you to take these conversations to heart
Please.
and really start paying attention to these dynamics in your own life. Ask yourself, where do I see these patterns playing out?
Yeah.
Who am I allowing to influence my thinking and behavior? And am I making choices that are truly aligned with my own values and my own truth?
Such powerful questions. By asking them, we start to reclaim our own power
Yes.
and create a world where manipulation and abuse have no place.
Well said. Now, as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to bring it back to the specific case we're examining today.
Okay.
Chris Butler and his organization.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that's been kind of swirling in my mind throughout this conversation is this question of accountability.
That's a really important question.
How do we hold people accountable for spiritual abuse?
Yeah.
Especially when it's so often shrouded in secrecy
Right.
and when the victims may be reluctant to come forward.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But I think there are a few things we can do.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One important step is to create a culture where people feel safe to come forward and to report abuse.
Okay.
And that means challenging that stigma that so often surrounds these issues
Yeah.
and creating spaces where survivors can share their stories without fear of judgment or retaliation.
So it's like we need to shift the narrative
Right.
from blaming the victim
Yeah.
to holding the abuser accountable.
Totally. And we need to educate ourselves about the signs of spiritual abuse
Mm-hmm.
and the tactics that abusers use so we can recognize it when we see it.
That's such a crucial point because often the people who are being abused don't even realize what's happening. They've
Right.
been so manipulated
Yeah.
and brainwashed that they don't see it for
Right.
what it is.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations,
Right.
to raise awareness about these issues. The more we talk about it, the less power abusers have to operate in secret.
And we also need to support the organizations and the individuals that are working to combat spiritual abuse.
Absolutely.
And provide resources for survivors.
There are a number of groups that are doing incredible work in this area, and they need our support.
Accountability is not just about punishment.
Right.
It's also about rehabilitation and restoration.
Yeah. It's about creating opportunities for those who've caused harm,
Yeah.
to confront their behavior, to make amends for the harm that they've caused.
It's also about providing support for survivors to heal and to reclaim.
Their lives and their sense of agency.
It brings us back to this particular deep dive
Yeah.
into Chris Butler and his organization.
Right.
You know, we've explored these disturbing accounts from former followers, these patterns of manipulation and control.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up, I'm left wondering what happens next.
It's a question that lingers, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to addressing spiritual abuse.
So it's not like there's this clear legal framework for holding someone accountable for this kind of harm?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
While some actions within these groups might be illegal,
Right.
like financial fraud or assault, the psychological manipulation itself is much harder to prove
Right.
in a legal sense.
That makes sense. It's not like there's a law against being a manipulative jerk.
Right. And that's why it's so important to focus on education, awareness, and creating a culture where these issues are actually taken seriously.
So it's about empowering people to recognize the signs of abuse and to know that they have options,
Yeah.
that they don't have to stay silent.
Exactly. And it's also about creating spaces
Yeah.
where survivors can share their stories and find support without fear of being shamed or disbelieved.
You know, these sources we're discussing today,
Yeah.
they're all from former members of Butler's organization.
That's right.
And I think their voices are so powerful.
Yeah.
Because they're speaking truth to power.
Absolutely.
They're challenging this system that was designed to silence them.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Their willingness to come forward and share their experiences is so courageous.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that even in the face of all this pressure and manipulation,
Yeah.
the human spirit can still find a way to resist.
And their stories are a beacon of hope for others.
Yes.
Who might be struggling in similar situations.
Totally.
They show that it is possible to break free from these cycles of abuse
All right.
and reclaim your own power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really what this whole deep dive has been about.
Yeah.
It's about empowering ourselves and each other to recognize and resist manipulation,
Right.
to seek out those healthy and supportive relationships,
Yeah.
and create a world where spiritual abuse just has no place.
Well said. To our listener, we hope this deep dive has been insightful and perhaps even a little bit unsettling.
I'm sure.
You know, it's not always comfortable to
Stop.
confront these dark realities,
Right.
but we believe it's essential to have these conversations if we
Yeah.
want to create a safer, more compassionate world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you've been personally affected by any of the issues that we've discussed today,
Yeah.
please know that you are not alone.
Yeah.
There are resources available to help you, and we encourage you to reach out and get that support.
So as we conclude this deep dive,
Yeah.
We want to leave you with a few final thoughts to ponder.
Okay.
First and foremost, you have the right to question, to doubt,
Yeah.
and to seek out your own truth.
Yes.
No one has the right to control your mind or your spirit.
Trust your gut.
Yeah.
If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore those red flags or try to rationalize them away.
Cultivate a strong support system outside of any group or organization. Stay connected with people who love you and who support your autonomy.
And remember that true spirituality is about love, compassion,
Yes.
and freedom.
Yes.
It's not about fear, control, or manipulation.
Thank you for joining us
Yeah.
on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We hope it sparks some important reflection and perhaps even inspired you to take action in your own life.
I hope so.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning,
Yes.
and keep trusting your own inner compass.